Okay, so it's going to be a really quick rundown of different energy sources. We're going to look at fossil fuels very briefly and then generally look at renewable sources. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer here that they're not going to be the world's best explanations. They're going to be quite brief, and I will probably miss out some advantages and disadvantages, but the main things will be there. So fossil fuels are what we use mostly to produce electricity. Like 70–80% of the electricity in the UK is produced using fossil fuels at this moment in time. Why? Well, because we're built to do that, okay? We built the system to use them. Because when we first started using fossil fuels, we had lots of them. We didn't realise the damage they were doing to the environment. So our entire economy is built around fossil fuels, okay? They're easy to find. They're pretty cheap compared to a lot of other resources. And most power stations are set up to use that, so it's just easy. That's the reason we're using them, but they're easy. What are the problems with them? Well, we're quickly running out. It's a bad thing. Especially for oil and gas. And the biggest issue is that they produce greenhouse gases. When they're burnt. Okay? For example, the big one is carbon dioxide, and that causes, global warming and climate change. Now, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but I can't really overstress how bad this is. Okay? It's the biggest problem that's facing our world today, a lot of people think. So fossil fuels are a huge issue because we're running out of them, and also they're just bad for the environment. So instead, we are looking at renewable energy sources to try and replace those things and to stop harming the environment. Now we're going to look at the renewable energy sources and the advantages and disadvantages in terms of the UK. So if we think about the UK, it's a pretty windy country. It's not very sunny. It's quite smallish. And also it's an island, which means we've got lots of coast. I can't write today, sorry. Coast. So when we're looking at these issues, we're going to kind of think about them in this way. We're going to think about them in terms of the UK. Obviously, you might have to think about them in other terms as well, but you can see how that one goes. You can apply those for yourself. All right, so we're going to look at each one in turn, starting with solar power. Now, solar power, there's two types. You can either have solar power that just provides heating, it just heats water, it doesn't make any electricity, it's just using the energy of the sun to heat things up. Or you can use photovoltaic cells, and they convert light to electricity, so these are producing electricity. And they do it using like a chemical process that we're really not going to go into, because you don't need to know it. But they all involve solar panels, so this is meant to be a solar panel. It's not particularly great. But solar panels can be put on roofs, or it doesn't have to be on a roof. In England it's usually on a roof, but it could be just in a field. Sometimes in Texas you see like rows and rows of solar panels in solar farms to collect the sun. Now the good thing about solar panels is that the sun will never run out. And the sun is free. So it's not going to charge you for using it. It also means that single houses, and especially remote areas, can have their own solar power, and they can be used to run small things that are quite remote and that you couldn't get to in the national grid. So they can be quite useful. The problems with them, the bad things, is that it's quite cloudy in the UK. They only work when it's sunny. And they're really quite expensive. So in a country that has lots of sun, it's probably more worth it. But here, we don't get enough. They're not particularly cost effective. They wouldn't be able to run a house, for example, from the solar panels on a roof, although they can help reduce your electricity bill. Okay, so solar power isn't the best probably for the UK, but it's an option that we can think about. Now, the next kind of 3 or 4 that we're going to look at all rely on the same basis, and that's the fact that we use turbines. Now, we know from the thermal power stations, and if you're not sure about that, have a look, that if you can spin a turbine, you can make electricity, because if you attach a turbine to a coil of wire that's inside a magnetic field, and that makes that spin, you're producing electricity. So all of these following ones work using this. If you can spin a turbine, you can make a generator work, you can make electricity. Now all wind power is that it uses the wind from the air to bob along and spin a turbine. And this turbine's attached to a generator at the back, and the generator has the wires attached, and the wires go to the national grid. So it's really quite easy to make wind power. The advantages of it is that in the UK it's very windy. We are apparently the windiest country in Europe, I've once read. So that's really helpful because it means we've got a lot of it there. You can make quite a lot of electricity from it. Sorry, I can't write and speak sometimes at the same time. A lot of electricity made with lots used together. So there is the potential that we can use lots of them to make quite a lot of our electricity. The problems are, we'll think about some more benefits in a moment, but some of the main problems are is that they, some people think they're ugly. I personally don't, I quite like them. They're quite expensive to build. This takes you back to the top. A positive is that the wind is free, so there's no fuel once it's set up. They can damage wildlife. Birds can run into them and get chopped up, basically, or habitats. And they can be quite noisy, so people don't want to live near them. A solution to that is that you can put them at sea. So then they're not in the way, and it's also more windy at sea, which is good. But then at sea, they're hard to fix. So there's lots of pluses and minuses, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. Wind is a more viable option though for the UK than solar power, I would say. Okay. The next one we're going to look at is hydroelectricity. Now this is already used in the UK in a couple of power stations. There's one called Electric Mountain in Wales. And there's a few different ways you can do this. They usually involve a dam. You can use it constantly, or you can use it as a kind of backup supply of electricity. So here, what we've got is, this is a river, and this is a dam. And a dam just stops the water from the river going over. It kind of blocks the river, okay? Now, if you make a channel through the dam, if you can see here, like an underground channel, which water is forced through instead of going over the river, you can put a turbine in that channel. And if that turbine spins, you can spin a generator, you can make electricity. And you can see here, like, this is meant to be, there's lots of these channels that you can use, okay? So the water is forced through the channel, which makes a turbine spin, which produces electricity by being connected to a generator. And that's because up here the water has got GPE, it's gravitational potential energy because it's higher up, and down here the energy has been converted into electrical energy. Sometimes this is a river that runs forever, and all rivers run forever. This is a river that continuously does this, or what you can have is instead of a river, you can have a reservoir up here, and you shut these off and you let the water through at peak time. So if you have to make electricity quickly, a large amount, you can turn on this power station really quite quickly within a matter of minutes. So you open up the floodgates as it is, you let the water through, the water spins a turbine, it goes to another reservoir here. Now, in these types, there's no river there to replenish the water. So what happens is that overnight, that water is then pumped back up to the top reservoir using the excess electricity from the national grid that isn't being used overnight. So that's what happens in the one in Wales, I know that. Okay, so hydroelectricity. Good things about it. We can produce a lot of power, and it's a lot of power very quickly. Okay, you can turn it on within a matter of minutes, which is pretty good. They create water supply reservoirs, as well as energy supplies, so that's quite nice. The bad things are they're expensive to build. It can affect local wildlife. Okay. Once again, it's probably up here that water is free. So once it's built, it's there. So the fuel isn't expensive because it's just the water, but it's expensive to actually build it. Okay. But these are actually a big solution that we use quite a lot already for last-minute emergency power necessities. So that's hydroelectricity. The next one is, I've kind of put these two together, wave and tidal. Now they are two separate things, but they do kind of work in a similar way, so I'm going to use them as once. And all it is that the energy from the movement of the water, you've guessed it, spins a turbine which is connected to a generator which makes electricity. So we just use the water. You either use the power of the waves or use the power of the tides. Now they're different things. The tide is when the water level rises and kind of comes in. The waves are more continuous and to do with, well, their waves. So they are slightly different, the two way they work, but they do all work spinning a turbine to make electricity by being connected to a generator. So the positive things about wave and tidal energy, especially for the UK, it's ideal for the UK because it's an island. So it has lots of coastlines. I really can't write coast today. Coasts. And so there's lots of areas that this could be used, and its potential to provide a lot of energy. Okay. The issues with them is that it's very expensive to build. But you know, the pro is that it's free once you've built it. Well, the energy's free, the fuel's free, and they can have a negative impact on wildlife, like a lot of them can. I'm going to write here as well, very expensive to build and maintain. The problem is if they break, they're underwater, they're hard to fix. And it's a similar problem to having wind turbines out at sea. As soon as you kind of put something there, it makes it much harder to look at, because it's not something you can just go and look at without kind of, you know, diving or being a bit more involved with the process. Okay, so it's got some really good positives, especially for the UK, because we're such an island country, but they are expensive, and once again we've got that negative impact on wildlife. Okay, then we get to geothermal. Only a couple more to go. Geothermal, there's two options here. Okay, one is another turbine spinner. Okay, so we can generate electricity, or we can just heat things. So it's kind of like those solar panels, so we could use them for just for heating or for making electricity. Now, all geothermal is geo, earth, and thermal is heat. So it's the heat from the earth. So if you dig underneath, as you go further towards the earth core or go underground, it gets hotter. Now, it happens to a certain extent everywhere, but there's some places where they have like geothermal kind of springs, such as like in Iceland. So places like that are more suited to this, but you can do it to an extent in lots of places. You can use heat pumps into the earth. So you have water. So imagine that this is filled with water, and the water goes around these pipes and it heats up down here, becomes steam, and then it can spin a turbine which is connected to a generator, and it makes electricity that way. Then it cools down, becomes water, and it gets pumped back around again. So that's one way of doing it. Or you can not have the turbine, you can just pump the water up and have a heat pump, and it can help with heating, kind of like those solar panels did before. So what are the good things and bad things about geothermal energy? The good thing is that it's already used successfully in other countries. So it's already used successfully in Iceland. Because like I said before, they have lots of kind of geothermal springs, e.g. Iceland. Okay, and it's obviously potentially infinite. The problems are it only really works well, like well enough that we can provide a lot of electricity from it, in volcanic regions or places where you have a lot of this activity. And it's, once again, it's expensive to set up. You're digging deep. To get to this kind of heat, you need to go quite deep down. Okay, so as you can see, a lot of these, they're free. Well, the fuel is free because the fuel is things like wind and solar power, etc. But they're expensive to build and they're expensive to keep going. There's one final one we're going to have a look at, and that is biofuel. And there's a couple of examples of this one. The first one is simply just growing things like wood. Okay, you can grow wood, and then you can burn it. Now you can burn it for heating in like stoves, etc. in houses, or you could burn it in a power station. A thermal power station would work on wood. And then you replant the trees. If you don't replant the trees, it's not renewable. It's also not carbon neutral. The other option over here, this is meant to be me drawing sugarcane. You can grow biocrops. So for example, sugarcane, this is what happens in Brazil, as far as I know, a lot of the time. It can then be processed to make bioethanol, which is an alternative to petrol, and can then be used to run cars, etc. This is quite a big process in Brazil, but the problem is that it takes up a lot of land. Okay, so let's have a look at the pros and cons of biofuel. It's cheap. It's not free because you are actually having to produce the fuel there. It's not like wind, etc. It's readily available. and it's renewable if you replant. So replanting makes it renewable. And also, if you replant, it makes it carbon neutral. Because when you burn the fuel, you are producing CO2s going outwards. But when you grow a plant, carbon dioxide is going in for photosynthesis to make the plant. So as long as you replant as much as you burn, it's carbon neutral, you're okay. So it's sustainable then if the plants are regrown. Problems are if it's not built, not replanted, it is carbon dioxide producing and non-renewable. And the big issue is that it takes up a lot of land that would otherwise be used for crops, or for example in Brazil a lot of this land is reclaimed rainforests, which is obviously getting rid of a lot of biodiversity. That's a huge issue with it. So we've got our big list of renewable energy sources that we've looked at, and if we think about the UK, which is windy, not very sunny, smallish and an island, it seems quite clear that our kind of ones that are best suited for us are wind power and probably tidal and wave power, hydroelectricity, those things that do with water. We're not as great at solar power. Biofuel is an option, I suppose, in some way, but we haven't got a lot of land spare, so it might be quite difficult. Geothermal can work to an extent in certain places, but not as well as it could in other places like Iceland. So you have to weigh up the pros and the cons of everything. There's also obviously the big idea of nuclear power, which is another option. And you have to think about all of these things. And a lot of exam questions ask you to weigh up the advantages and disadvantages of different types, including fossil fuels. So make sure you know advantages and disadvantages for each and the basics of how they work.